Move on to our next speaker. Jean-Lou, if you could stop sharing your screen, excellent. And so, yeah, our next speaker is also one of the organizers of this symposium, Christian Nawroth. Probably you know him, but just as a short introduction, Christian is now a postdoctoral researcher with the Institute of Behavioral Physiology here at the FBN in Dummersdorf. And his research interests are mainly in farm animal cognition, but he also works on other species as well. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what all the results you achieved with your goat research. So the floor is yours, Christian.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Anta, for the introduction. As Jan already pointed out at the very start of the symposium, Katrina and I are going to present some of the results that we got from our current goat project. This one, as you can already see from the title, refers to learning and cognition in goats, in particular in different selection lines of goats. Jan already mentioned this. We tested at 2 locations. We tested 2 selection lines. We had a total of 120 domestic goats that we tested in our research setting. And Katrina will go into more detail of this, why we did this. We only tested for the learning and cognition part, only 1/3 of our testing sample. So 1/3 of the goats actually were exposed to cognitive testing. We know that breeds of farm animals can often differ fundamentally in their phenotype, as you can see in these 2 illustrations here. And these differences can be caused by selection for certain environmental factors. For example, they can, when we look at, for example, pets, they can be caused by human preferences. So humans select specific phenotypes just because they look interesting or look more novel than the other ones. And they can also be shaped by selection for certain production traits, as illustrated in these last 2 images here. But this most often comes with, this direct selection most often comes with side effects. So selection aims, like selection for increased milk yield, can indirectly affect the physiology and behavior of farm animals. This might lead to changes in the temperament or the personality traits of the farm animals. This might change the anti-predator responses of different breeds, and this might also affect fear responses, for example. And specifically, when we want to look deeper into learning and cognition, one theory might be potentially interesting for this approach. And this is a so-called resource allocation theory. It basically implies that the more energy you put into a certain trait, in this case, production traits, the less energy you have left for everything else, including mental processes such as learning or cognitive capacities. So we would expect that, according to this resource allocation theory, that we would find, for example, a reduced behavioral flexibility in breeds selected for higher production goals. I need to mention here, Anissa is today here as well. She might present some of this research as well. Dutt et al. Followed the same approach in 2018, but they did not find they could not support with their findings this research allocation theory and did not find differences between different laying hen lines. But there might be effects on other cognitive traits as well that we are not aware of. When we, for example, look at research and for example, cognition research in canines, there's this huge and abundant mass of papers that look at what dogs are unique at and, for example, how domestication has shaped the behavior of dogs. And one thing that most people agree on is that domestication has changed how dogs interact with humans. So how their social cognition has changed via the pathway of domestication. Some people have argued that that might be the case for physical cognitive capacities as well, but for now there is no conclusive evidence that there's that domestication or in general had an impact on physical cognition. So we might expect, if domestication via a decreased emotional reactivity has changed the behavior of animals towards humans and how they can pick up human communicative cues, for example, we might expect that something similar might have happened when we select animals for certain production traits, which have a side effect of, for example, decreased emotional reactivity. So our aim here was to test draft goats, which were not selected for production traits, and dairy goats selected for milk yield in their behavioral flexibility and how they compare in their interpretation of physical and social cues. For this, we exposed them to a learning and reversal learning task, and we also had 2 different batteries of physical and social cues provided to them. This is just a quick video of how the setup looked like. So all tests were administered as an object choice task. The animal was behind a mesh and was able to indicate choice by putting their snout through the mesh. So in this case, the black cup was rewarded and hidden out of sight or baited out of sight of the subject, and then the subject can choose again and goes again for the black cup or the black container and chooses correctly and gets the reward. So in the first learning and reversal learning phase, we had a total of 20 sessions that we administered to the subjects. Each consisted of 12 trials, and our learning criteria was that subjects had to be 10 or more out of 12 trials correct in 2 consecutive sessions. Half of the subject received the black container as rewarded, and the other half received the white container as rewarded. And after they successfully learned this in the initial learning task, they were exposed to a reversal learning task where the other color was the rewarded one. Really quick, just the statistics here. We included selection line as fixed effects and the color of the cup as another fixed effect as well, because they might have some initial predisposition for one of the either black or white boxes. And put into the random effects the pen nested in location. Here are the results from the learning task. You see here the selection lines, the draft goats and the dairy goats, and you see that they do not differ a lot in the number of sessions that they need to reach the learning criteria. However, we found an effect of color, and this here specifically means that the animals that had the black container as a rewarded one were way faster in learning this contingency than the ones that had the white container as a rewarded stimulus. We then switched these contingencies in the reversal learning, and we see here that color now does not impact their learning success anymore. We see also that in general, the number of sessions they needed to reach the criterion is higher than in the initial learning task, which is something that you usually see when you ask animals or when you ask individuals in general to relearn a contingency. And learn now that forward previously not rewarded contingency is now rewarded. But what we also see is that the draft goats needed less sessions to reach that learning criteria compared to the dairy goats. So to sum this up, draft goats learn a reversal learning task faster than dairy goats, while there were no differences in the initial learning phase. As mentioned, we tested at 2 locations, and the covariance that was explained by location as a random factor was rather marginal compared to the fact that we saw when we compared the selection lines. We also wanted to see whether they differ in the use of physical and social cues. This is usually as well conducted via object choice test, as you can see here for this lemur. And most often these tests are administered or have been previously administered with primates and dogs. There's more papers coming out now where more exotic species, as Rebecca already stated, that are now exposed to these kind of tests as well to get a broader picture of the cognitive capacities of more animal species. And what you usually can do is you can run a single test and assess a very specific difference, like whether they can use indirect information, whether they can use or pick up human pointing gestures to find the location of a reward. But you can also administer a whole battery of different physical and social cues and assess the general differences between groups of animals. For example, when it comes to using physical cues or social cues, as we are going to do with the goats, or as we did with the goats. So what we did, we administered 5 different test conditions for the physical cues. I'm not going to go through those in the detail. Drop me an email or drop me a text in the chat and I can clarify those. So we had 5 different test conditions: direct visual information, indirect visual information, the same for acoustic information, where we were shaking the cups basically, and the transposition task, where we were baiting the cups in full view of the subject, and then we changed the position of both cups. And of course, we had a control condition to see whether animals picked up any other cue from the experimenter or from the test design. For the social cues, we used 3 varieties of pointing gestures: a sustained one, a momentary pointing gesture, and one pointing gesture from the incorrect location. We also administered the body orientation as a social cue, and we used a marker where we placed a small yellow dice, I think, on top of one of the containers of the rewarded container. I wanted to see whether the animals can use this marker as a cue to find the food reward as well. And here again, we had a control condition. The statistics look quite similar to the one before. This time we had as response variable the choice, whether they chose correct or incorrect. We used as fixed effects the condition for each of the test batteries and the selection lines. Random effects were experimenter, and the session nested in ID, nested in pen, and nested in location. So let's go to the results. As mentioned in the introduction, we did not really expect to see differences in the physical comprehension, but we expected to see differences in the social dimension, that the ones that have been bred for higher production goals and might have been also indirectly bred for lower emotional reactivity towards humans might show better performance in the social conditions. Well, these are the results for the physical cues. You see that the selection line did not affect the performance in all the test conditions. The dairy goats are highlighted in red, and in blue-green, the draft goats are highlighted in the graph as well. And you see that they mainly overlap in all of the conditions. But what we see is that they were the goats showed a different performance according to the conditions that we presented. And interestingly, goats were able to use 4 out of the 5 test conditions, I mean the visual direct, visual indirect, the acoustic direct as well, and the transposition compared to the control condition, but they were not able to solve the acoustic indirect condition. And this is not surprising, as we thought that this condition is probably the most difficult to solve anyway. Here we have the results for the social cues. Again, the dairy goats are seen highlighted in red, and the draft goats in this greenish color. Again, we see that selection line did not impact the performance in the use of the social cues. And again, condition had a significant effect in explaining the performance. And here again, we see that in these 5 test conditions, 4 of them, including all 3 pointing gestures, the sustained, momentary, and incorrect pointing gesture, the goats performed above chance level or better than the control condition. This was also the case when it comes to using a marker, but they were not able to infer from the body orientation of the experimenter where to look or where to search for the reward location. So to wrap this up, for physical and social cues, we did not find differences between selection lines, which was especially surprising for the social cues. The performance in the physical cues confirms and extends our research that we have done on visual information, on the use of visual information and transpositions in draft goats. So we now extended this to dairy goats as well. What is quite novel is that the goats are also able to use direct acoustic information. This is something we did not know before, but that they are not able to use indirect acoustic information. That means they cannot infer by a lack of noise that they have to search for the reward in another container. The social cues, or the performance in the social cues, confirms and extends also research on the use of pointing gestures that we have done with different populations of goats, but also work from others like Kaminsky et al. 2005. Our research here shows that goats are also able to use the marker, which we did not know before, and also confirms that goats apparently are not able to use gaze or head direction or body orientation of experimenters in order to solve this task. Again, the covariance that was explained by experimenter or location was rather marginal compared to the effects that we found with the fixed factors. So to wrap the whole presentation up, we tested whether draft goats and dairy goats differ in their behavior flexibility, and we found that draft goats were faster in learning a visual reversal learning task compared to the dairy goats, but we did not find any differences in the interpretation of physical or social cues. So that's from my side, and I'm happy to get into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for this nice presentation, Christian. And yeah, this presentation is also open for discussion now. So are there any questions? So now I only see clapping hands, not raised hands. Then maybe I can ask a question. Okay, Liza is raising her hand. So of course, she's allowed to ask first. Liza, go ahead.
Oops, I'm trying to unmute. If no one else is asking a question, I should already know. I should have already asked you this in person, Christian, but because I didn't. Then are you not surprised by this behavioral flexibility difference? Is that now rethinking what you'd predict about breed differences? Does it make sense to you, this direction for the behavioral flexibility, and that maybe selection pressures haven't influenced the other cognitive and social dimensions as much? Is that kind of your bigger takeaway?
Our initial hypothesis was, Jan mentioned as well that we tested wild goats. We haven't finally or finished analyzing or putting this data into this data set that I just presented. So our hypothesis was that we would probably see a steady decrease depending on the level of domestication that the animals have. So wild animals having the highest behavioral flexibility, they have to deal with with the natural environment, which can change in more or less unpredictable ways in a short period of time. Go into domesticated animals that are kept in extensive systems, for example, draft goats, and animals selected for high production that can also be kept in extensive systems, but are also kept in intensive systems, which do not really require a high amount of behavioral flexibility as their environment stays relatively stable over time. So that would be our main hypothesis on this. And finding that the draft goats needed lower sessions in terms of solving this task kind of confirms this prediction, at least when we look at the draft and the dairy goats.
Are there further questions from the auditorium right now? Maybe I just have to threaten to have a question of my own then. Last time it worked. So my question would be, do you think, because I mean, in your studies comparing the dwarf goats and the dairy goats, of course you raised your experimental animals in a very comparative way, but usually the dairy goats should be, should have a long history of being handled by humans, while the dwarf goats aren't as intensively handled. Do you think there might also be epigenetic effects that play a role here in how scared they might even be in testing situations, or how relaxed and calm they are when because these testing situations always involve close interaction with a human? And do you think there are also might be transgenerational epigenetic effects if you take dairy goat kids and raise them with contact to humans, and dwarf goat kids and raise them in contact to humans?
I mean, we tested, especially for the draft goats, for example, a rather limited population. That means the draft goats from the research station here. So I think we cannot make very extremely bold claims in terms of if this affects all draft goats, and it would probably be impossible to run a study that would make us able to make these claims. But what we observed when we interacted with the animals, coming back to this emotional reactivity that I mentioned before in the talk as well, was that the dairy goats also, we kept them under the same conditions, and we kept them with the same human-animal interactions in terms of how the experimenters approached them and interacted with them. The dairy goats had been either from the very start showed way less fearful behavior towards humans, or showed a way steeper habituation to being handled by humans. The most striking difference was probably when we tested at Tänikon, and Katrina surely remembers this as well, when we basically had to dodge the dairy goats because they wanted to interact with us, while we still had struggles to catch the draft goats at the same amount, but they had the same experience with humans, or the same time experience in us as humans interacting with them. So I would assume that there are general differences in terms of their emotional reactivity, which might be caused by ontogenetic factors. Dairy goats, for example, are weaned, or usually weaned quite early, and the draft goats here at the research station are weaned later. This might explain some of these effects. Yeah, it might be also genetic or epigenetic. So I would strongly expect that if you select animals for production traits, you also directly or maybe indirectly select animals that are not fearful against humans, just to decrease risk of injury for the animal or the handler or the farmer.
Yes, thank you. Are there any more questions? We still have plenty of time for questions, people. I see now a hand raised. Jim, please go ahead and state your question.
Hey, Christian, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, do you think physical differences between the different lines could come into play to any extent here in these kind of cognitive tests?
Could you provide an example? What do you exactly mean with that?
So, for example, with dogs, for example, it's thought that actually some breed differences that were found in terms of following point cues could actually relate to the physical differences in the head and the positioning of the eyes. And I was wondering with the goats here, I mean, as far as I understand, the dwarf goats are quite small. I'm not sure exactly the size of the dairy goats you were testing, but do you think some simple differences like this could come into play simply because of the physical setup of your tests?
We tried to, we've been aware about the size differences. So we, for example, tried to be implementing this into our testing environment. So we had, you saw the sliding board that we presented to the animals, and we had different heights of the sliding board, depending whether we tested the draft goats or the dairy goats. So the draft goats not just see the sliding board above their head, while we still have the same height for the dairy goats. So we tried to implement these phenotypic differences in terms of body size, at least, into our setting, and hopefully, yeah, did not cause any issues or confounding effects with other parameters on this. But you're right. I think that depending on the, I think there was also a paper depending on the snout head ratio of dogs, depending on whether they are better or worse in following human pointing gestures. Given that we did not find any difference in general for the social cues, I'd say that there was probably not a confounding factor that was related to the physical characteristics of the goats themselves.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Any further questions? If not, I thank you very much, Christian, for your presentation and the discussion. And with this, I would like